Okay, so last time we left off, we looked at instances of resistance, and particularly active resistance by those in Africa. And hopefully, what you've done so far is read two biographies on resistance to imperialism. We had previously mentioned Menelik II, and now we want to be able to take a look at, and there is hopefully there's Menelik on the right hand side here in full royal attire. There is. And the other individual that we saw is this is Mongkok and one of his son, particularly his heir. Okay? And so you saw two instances of resistance to Western imperialism by two, I think, smaller states. What about the bigger ones? So we're going to examine in the next couple days here responses by Asian powers to the new imperialism, particularly the major empires. We're going to examine, for instance, the Ottoman Empire. We will take a look at the Qing dynasty in China, and then what's left of the Mughal Empire and the other various princely states in India as well. But this is part one, and in part one, we're going to take a look at East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. So we're going to take a look at and examine these regions, the Ottoman Empire, and then also Persia, Afghanistan, and Central Asia as well. So our first part is to start where about as far off as you possibly can, sort of the last frontier of the globe, at least for the Western world. And part of that last frontier is the discovery of the last continent, Australia, and the eventual colonization of the British in Australia and New Zealand. Some of the initial settlers happen to be prisoners that they were sent as a prisoner colony, and also the development of a colony in New Zealand as well. But like we saw with the Columbian exchange in the Americas, okay, European migration also means the transmission of new animals and new diseases as well that was previously unknown to Australia. And so, even though today sheep herding, for example, is very well known in New Zealand, this was a brand new species, in a lot of ways, an invasive species into Australia and New Zealand. Okay, this is the same with, turns out, one of the most destructive and cute creatures that ended up in Australia is the rabbit. Again, the rabbit is known for not only digging holes but also reproduction as well. Okay, now like many others across the British Empire, in many of these cases, particularly the white colonies, whether in Canada or in South Africa, eventually, these, because it's mostly formerly British residents, they were allowed and given self government. As opposed to the rest of the British Empire, where if there are traditional natives that are the vast majority of the population, it was a colony ruled directly by or somewhat indirectly by the British Empire. Many of the native tribes, the Maoris and Aborigines of Australia and New Zealand and the South Pacific Islands, will also suffer from discrimination, disease, and conquest as well. Now, Britain, France, um, we're not the only ones. That includes the United States and its colonization of the and conquest initially of the Hawaiian Islands, and then moving farther west. And there's a number of islands that may be familiar to you, and eventually to the Philippines as well, which was conquered through the Spanish-American War from Spain as well, leaving the only individual that we looked at previously, King Munguk and Siam, as a lot of ways the last independent Asian state that wasn't dramatically either conquered or influenced by the European and Western powers. Okay, but the trend that we see throughout this time period is a number of things. Okay, so and you can almost apply this to when it comes to the empires of the rest of the world. Again, these aren't just simply weaker states or kingdoms or decentralized regions where there isn't a central authority. These are now some of the most historically powerful empires of the time period. Okay? And so the trend is this. Okay? We really begin with, in the West, industrial revolution, the various democratic revolutions resulting in imperialism. Okay? And for empires like the Ottoman and the Chinese, there is the realization, sometimes through battle, sometimes through war, that their technology is inferior. Their government, particularly the bureaucracies, aren't functioning as efficiently as the Western states. And not only that, but with the Industrial Revolution, a dramatic sense of economic inferiority. They're just not producing, making the profit as quickly, as efficiently as these industrialized states. And so there's a response by some, again, not all members of their societies, as a means to try to modernize. Oftentimes, you need money, resources, and capital in order to make this happen. Okay? And in order for this to occur, okay, they need money. Okay? And it's the Western financing and Western bankers that will make this happen. Okay? Oftentimes there's some success, maybe moderate success, but in the end, it's not enough. And the conservatives of societies, whether they're religious groups and others, are going to respond to these dramatic changes, almost near revolutionary changes, and they're going to try to say, like, we got to go back to the past. Okay? It's not modernization that is causing issues in our empires, it's something else. Okay, that backlash leads all of a sudden to a further decline in the empire and the eventual revolution that will take place that overthrows that particular empire as is. Okay? And so you can imagine there's a little imagery that we could use for this time period whereby there is I use this image like a boiling pot, right? So here are all the changes, right, brought about the new heat that's coming on to the empire. Hey, things start to bubble up quite a bit. Hey, the conservatives try to put a lid on what's changing, but if the fire continues, hey, it results in bam, explosion. In a lot of ways, that's the trend that we're going to see in the empires, the Ottomans, the Mughals, and the Chinese empires as well. But before we get to that, a few review questions before we get to our first topic, that is the Ottoman Empire. So go to your textbook, go to page 525, okay, and then answer this question here. Okay? Explain the Ottoman experiences with science and art in the 18th century. So go and pause the video right now and answer this question in the Google document that is provided. Okay, you should be done with the first review question. Okay, let's go and start with the Ottomans. Now, the Ottoman Empire, okay, one of the traditional vast empires that we looked at the opening of the curriculum, um, is historically one of the most powerful as well. Okay? But by the 19th and 20th century, is on the verge of decline. And this is declines can happen because of a number of reasons, and we're going to sort through each one of these here. And a lot of it has to deal with how the Turkish core, and so the Turkic identity, Turkic Muslim identity will be challenged in a number of places, okay, ranging from Russian incursions in the Caucasus Mountains, okay, the rise of religious leadership in the Arabian Peninsula, okay, the rise of a bureaucratic leader in Egypt, okay, liberal ideas that are in the European part of its empire, and also further Russian incursions into the Black Sea region as well. Okay, so let's take a look at each one of these. And one that we're going to examine first is a review topic for you, and that's on page 582. So go ahead and review the reforms made by Muhammad Ali in the Ottoman province of Egypt, okay, and go and summarize that as the second review question in your Google Docs. So go and take a moment, pause the video right now, and answer this question right here. All right, guys, okay, go ahead and hopefully you've examined one of these cases of internal struggle in the Ottoman Empire. Okay? The first of which is the notion of empire itself. Look, okay? Empires run on on the ability of the imperial successor to do well. Okay? But we've all known people who have grown up luxuriously in places that where they're rarely ever challenged. And so when you have a possible leader all of a sudden growing up in a palace, they have no idea the struggles of the people across their empire. And so frequently, the successor individual isn't going to do as well as the father. Okay? Not only that, okay, but there are a number of internal issues as well. Okay? That includes like one that we saw in the Middle East, the birth of conservatives uh, in the religious establishment, particularly the Saud family in Arabia, the rise of what we call Wahhabism, religious conservatism, those who want a much more rigid enforcement of religious law, of the Quran, of um, the Sharia as well. And so the way their view is that the decline of the Ottomans isn't necessarily because it fails to modernize. Instead, it's because it's failed to be faithful. Another regional pressure is what you just read about in terms of Muhammad Ali in Egypt, a challenge, almost like a state or a province that's challenging the center, as the primary means of in the core of the empire. Okay? There are also independence movements in Serbia. There's a country we're going to take a look at in greater detail later, and Greek nationalism. The notion of these Christian Orthodox individuals with a Slavic identity, or in the case of the Greeks, their own long-standing history, perhaps declaring independence. And so you have independence movements in both of these cases. Okay? And not only that, but you have imperialism as well. Okay? Italy is starting to set its sights on the old ancient parts of the Roman Empire, including North Africa. They have already taken Libya and have their eyes set on Egypt as well. And so there are all these various regional pressures that may be forcing dramatic change in the Ottoman Empire. And furthermore, any attempts to modernize have been resisted upon by religious leaders. Okay, which hopefully saw from this question two in the background questions, and then also the old elite military force that throughout the 16th, 17th centuries were some of the top-notch military troops around the world. By the 18th and 19th centuries, they're obsolete. Okay? They have now passed on their status to families that traditionally they weren't supposed to have, and they want to resist change because they are empowered by the old traditional systems. Okay? So there are a muck of internal issues in the Ottoman Empire, but then there are also Western issues. The Greek independence movement, for example, becomes this liberal democratic pipe dream for people in Britain and France and the United States, many of which actually not only donated money, but actually traveled to Greece to fight against the Ottomans for independence. Not only that, but the empire that everyone actually fears, the Russian Empire, just because it is so large. Russia itself has set its sights on parts of the Ottoman Empire in the Caucasus Mountains, but particularly in the Balkan region in southern Europe, where they're going to look at the ethnic identity of those in southern Europe, particularly the Slavic identity, and they're going to support the independence movements there, and particularly with this small country called Serbia, which was a kingdom taken over by the Ottomans in the 14th century. And as Serbia not only declares independence, but hopes to start a southern European kingdom of its own, Russia continues to back Serbian growth. Okay? And as mentioned before, Muhammad Ali, his rise in Egypt meant an invasion from Egypt of Arabia and other parts of the Ottoman Empire, which eventually failed. But this was one of the signs for the Ottoman Empire that it was not sustaining the empire as it used to be. But nothing demonstrated this more than the Crimean War in the 1850s, where Russia's incursions into southern Europe, the European part of the Ottoman Empire, meant that the Ottomans had to defend against themselves, against the Russians, excuse me, and they couldn't do it alone. And so, because of the economic investment made in the Ottomans by the British and French, they ended up aiding the Ottomans. Not only that, but they also feared Russian growth, and so they decided to aid the Ottoman Empire, helping the Ottomans to win this war against Russia. But what it demonstrated was that the Ottoman Empire needed to change. They needed to reorganize. And the term reorganization in Turkish means Tanzimat. And so this is what historians have called the Tanzimat modernization, whereby throughout parts of the 19th century, and this doesn't happen all at one time, it's not like a 4 or 5 year program, but it's here and there whenever the Ottoman Sultan allows for it, is the creation of political changes. For instance, a French style secular constitution that was formed in 1876, new civil codes, and regional assemblies that are created, all of which is going to override some of the traditional Sharia laws that are in place. A fair taxation system is placed upon Christians and Jews as opposed to the old jizya system. So now all of a sudden, what that means is that the old class breakdown between religious groups, between Muslims and then Christians and Jews, this means political equality for Christians and Jews, which was opposed by some Muslims and even some Christians and Jews who, and particularly the leadership, that were given power and influence because they had to act as intermediaries. But either way, there are political changes that are allowed for in the Ottoman Empire. The Janissary Corps is finally dissolved, and instead, a Western style system of conscription of Ottoman citizens were brought into the picture. So now that means it's not just simply Muslims who are fighting in the Ottoman Empire, but it would be a diverse army as well. Okay? There is the creation of a public education system, and not only that, but a land code as a means to try to increase land cultivation, because land that is cultivated means taxes to the state, and the state needs revenue and needs a lot of it because it needs to rebuild and create a modern infrastructure, okay? Railroad systems, ports that allow for steamships to come in and out. Okay? But what that also means is that it means debt. Okay? And as a result of this, they're going to go to French, American, British bankers and say, hey, we need someone to bankroll all of this here. Okay? And that's going to leave them vulnerable to French and British influence. So, whereby at one point the Ottoman Empire was this center of trade along the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean trade routes from East Asia to the Middle East and Europe. It used to be the middleman. All of a sudden now, they have been bypassed by the steamships of the world. And so, as a result of this, probably the biggest struggle for the Ottoman Empire is that it is now what many Europeans call the poor man of Europe. As noted, no longer the center of global trade, it was weakened already by the Spanish silver trade, which put too much currency into circulation, resulting in the inflation of Ottoman currency. The reforms that were made in the 19th century were moderately successful, but like we see in other places, look, the British industry, American industry is just too strong. Okay? The Ottomans and others just simply cannot compete against these powerful industries without high tariffs, which is going to, in the end, cost quite a bit for the consumers of the Ottoman Empire. And so, because there's this reliance on Western funding, they're going to give Westerners, particularly the French, who will become the most influential in the Ottoman Empire, as you can kind of see in this advertisement, which is actually done in France, in French, extra rights. In other words, it's what we call extraterritoriality, where French bankers and citizens are given extra benefits. They are exempt from some local laws just based on their status as foreigners. And so imagine now the resentment from people of the Ottoman Empire, where you have these foreigners coming in and given some extra rights that they don't have any control over. Okay? In the end, okay, and the result is the decay and decline of the Ottoman Empire. Whereas there were some changes made by Tanzimat, okay, when there was a coup and a new sultan was placed on the throne, a man by the name of Abdul Hamid. Many of the liberal reformers thought he would actually start to enact his program. Instead, he went the other way around. And so he brought about a much more conservative movement, and he brought about the notions of pan-Islamism once again, that perhaps the Ottoman Empire would restore the old Abbasid caliphate of old, whereby the Ottoman Empire is failing, again, because it wasn't faithful enough. Okay? And so as a result of this, there's further Ottoman decline in the late 19th century, leading eventually to a group, many of which are educated overseas in places like Paris, known as the Young Turks, who are going to seize power in a military coup in 1908. And they're going to keep the Sultan on the throne, but really they're pulling the strings in the government in trying to create, as much as they can, a Western style government. Okay? But is it too little too late? Okay? The war that begins in 1914 will show this. Okay? And so go ahead and at this point here, before we move on to the next part here, go back to our textbooks in page 527. And before we take a look at Central Asia, go back to take a look at one of the key empires of this period, which is the Safavid Empire in the 17th century. So explain some defining characteristics of this state. So go and pause the video right now one more time and go and answer this question in your Google Doc. All right, guys, you should be back after doing review question number 3. Let's go and wrap up this part in examining Persia. Okay. The Safavid Empire that doesn't last long. In fact, it actually is taken over by a number of Turkic tribesmen, and they're going to create what is known as the Qajar kingdom. But the Qajar rulers, in a lot of ways, allow for some of these traditional Shiite leaders. In other words, the religious leaders that have had major influence under the Safavids to remain in power in doing so. And so many of the religious leaders still played a major role in the Persian Empire. Okay. One reformer, as we get to the late 19th century, actually realized the need for modernization and change. A man by the name of Nasir al-Din, who began his reign as a reformer, bringing in ideas such as the secularization of government, introducing technologies like the telegraph, postal services, roads, opening some of the first schools as well, including Iran's first newspaper as well. He was very much impressed by technology. In order to make this happen, just like we see with the Ottoman Empire, they gave concessions to Western traders, and Western advisors and so forth. So in other words, again, just like we see with the Ottomans, Westerners are come in, they are operating off a different law. They're given major concessions to build, to invest. Oftentimes, a great example of this is eventually in the oil business, where British companies come in, and you have the Persian government that's making for them a railway, giving them an enormously great deal on the oil, right? They can extract almost all of it for their benefit. The Persian government gets very little of it in return for their work in extracting the oil. So things like that are occurring. Okay? Um, Massive Western concessions that's going to lead to eventually people being very frustrated and the eventual overthrow of Nasir al-Din as he tried to reverse some of these concessions. A number of weak successors will follow, and what they will try to do is to create a new constitution in 1906 that is distinctly Western in nature. But this fails, leading to further revolutions and eventually a military coup that will establish the modern state of Iran in the 20th century. Okay? The two countries that would influence Central Asia and Persia the most are its two neighbors. Okay? In the north, you have Russia, which is going to start to move into Central Asia and establish some of those Central Asian states like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and others. And then also the rulers of India, Great Britain as well, where the northern border has always been a little bit iffy. And so these two countries are now in a lot of ways competing against one another in what historians call the great game, as explorers and other individuals are coming in trying to influence the local chiefdoms to join their side and so forth here. Okay. Eventually there's going to be an entente, basically a release of tensions between the British and the Russians over this particular region here. But either way, hey, there is a um, uh, expansion of the British state in India and Central Asia, and then also by Russia as well. So, lastly, just as a conclusion here, go ahead and explain why the Ottoman Empire failed to modernize in the 19th century. So, do a quick recap of the lecture, go back through the points here, and be able to answer this question. And we're going to continue next time with India. All right, guys, catch you next time.